Hello everyone and welcome to the first National Women in Science Day. We are here with almost 500 today to celebrate the International Day of Girls and Women in Science together. I'm Anne van der Jeugd, the president of BWISE, Belgian Women in Science Association, and together with the Belgian universities, we compiled an exciting program for today. We're going to highlight the achievements of women in science. I'm delighted to have over 20 speakers from several scientific and cultural backgrounds that will enlighten us today regarding this important matter. Our afternoon consists of 3 interesting panel discussions, including research on gender bias, ways to correct this gender bias, and also the importance of mentoring of young scientists. This is followed by an inspirational and refreshing lecture on the importance of shaping our personal lens on self-worth. Finally, we have 4 scientists at different stages in their career who will share their experiences with us. Before we start, I would like to thank our colleagues who helped organizing this unique day. I want to thank the BWISE board members, of course, but also the VUB Equality team for providing the Zoom license, the UGent Bottom-Up Initiative, the Bioengineers for Diversity team for setting up this event, the Gender and Diversity Commission of the Faculty of Bioscience Engineering at UGent for financing the Picture a Scientist movie license, the KU Leuven for financial support, and finally, Pop-Up Yoga Concepts for providing the gifts for all who are now listening today. This said, I would like to also remind you, for those who registered to the documentary Picture a Scientist, that you can still watch this interesting movie until Sunday afternoon. Before we kick off, I would also like to remind you that we would love to hear from you, so I urge you to pose your questions during the chat. And I also want to encourage you to share your experiences during this event via your social media channels. You can use the designated hashtag. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's moderators. Tanja van Loon, she's the Vice President of Belgian Women in Science, and Liv Theresa Mut for the Bioengineers for Diversity team.
And with that, I am taking over from Anne. Thank you very much for your intro. And before we dive into the content matters of this exciting Women in Science Day, quick reminder about the movie that you can also watch. And before we go on, I would like to set some housekeeping rules for this Zoom meeting we have today. So first of all the participants are muted by default to avoid confusion with who's talking and who's not talking. So only our panel members have this option to unmute themselves. If you have any questions, both technical or content related, please use the Zoom chat function to post your questions there. If you have a certain question for a speaker or for participants, please indicate that in the chat as well. Please note that this Women in Science Day is recorded and the recording will be made available for all the participants afterwards. In case you are not so sure about if you want to have your name or your video on the recording as well, you can turn off your camera and you can rename your Zoom account to an anonymous one. Then after each panel discussion, we would also like to engage the participants in a question round. So you have the chance after every panel discussion to post your questions. And I'm happily inviting you to already do so while you're listening to the talk itself. That makes it easier for me to pick some questions for afterwards. And for me, too important note is that you also address the person you would like to ask that question to. And throughout this Women in Science Day 2021, we are using Mentimeter, as you can already see here, for interactivity. And in order to join the menti.com app or software, you can use your smartphone or your computer. So you just go to menti.com as indicated in the top of this slide, and then use the code provided here. Also, Joanna will post the code and an access link in the chat as well now, so you can join. And with that, I would already like to test out how Mentimeter works for you and would like to ask you with this Energizer, what are you drinking right now? So you can choose one of the options so we see how good you're acquainted for this meeting and prepared with some coffee, water, or something else. that looks like water is the most frequently used drink currently, followed by nothing, no drink at all, coffee and tea. And already 50 people joined the Mentimeter. I will give it a couple of more seconds so everyone has a possibility to join. So it looks like we have the majority on board on Mentimeter. And with that, we dive into more content-related questions, where I give the floor to Anne to get you acquainted for the first panel discussion.
Okay, we can now start with the first topic. What is the problem? The so-called leaky pipeline, but I would like to know your estimates of how big this problem really is. And I want to invite you again for a quick poll on menti.com. So the first question is, what is the percentage of PhD candidates in the European Union? Okay, Liv, I think we can close the poll now. And I see indeed, yeah, almost there. So it's in fact, the correct answer is 45%. Now the second question is, what is the percentage of female professors in the EU? Please vote. Yeah, Liv, I think we can close the voting and show the right answer. And here the correct answer is less than 20%, it's 18%. So just like we expected, a lot of us underestimated the problem. So, but what is really the problem? What is it that keeps the women out of science? What happens in these years? There are many reasons. One of it's, for instance, the lack of role models. You can't be what you can't see. Another reason is that the combination of a family and science career is not easy. Also, stereotypes play a role. And another reason, of course, is the inequality that still exists in science. Name me 5 Nobel Prize winners, and the chances are big that you think of men first. Let's have an expert's view on this in our first panel discussion. Tanya?
Thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a good way of celebrating Women in Science National Day for young women and young girls. So I would like to welcome the first 5 members of our discussion, which I can already see, so thank you for being there. And we will first explore today in this session what is gender bias and where do we stand today. So the panelists come from very different fields of research. It ranges from sociology to electronics. They're involved in research about gender stereotype, gender bias. They're involved sometimes in diversity policies, coping mechanism of underrepresented groups, or they experience themselves working in a very gender unbalanced environment. We're very pleased that they all agreed to share their experience and their findings. And when we will start, I will ask each panelist to present themselves briefly. And I think it's a good way of having more of a snapshot information on where they are and why this topic is important for them. For the audience, as Liv mentioned, there will be a time for question and answer or just for comments at the end of each of the panels. So it means that you can put your question in the chat box And when you do so, please indicate the name of the panelist you want the question to be addressed to, if there is, if it is specific. I will start now with Robin to kick off the discussion. So Robin, in your views, what role does bias play in the gender distribution that we see in academia generally? And here we define bias very broadly as the inclination toward or the prejudice against one gender. Robin, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to be sure, is it the idea that we first introduce ourselves and then give an answer to the first question, or what would be?
Yes, you can do both together.
Yeah, okay, very good. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robin de Vroe, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Sciences of Ghent University. And there, my main research interest is political representation and voting behavior, with a specific focus on the representation of women in politics, or to say with a better word, the underrepresentation of women in politics. And I'm mainly focusing on where this underrepresentation comes from and how we can better understand the causal mechanisms behind it. And therefore, my doctoral work, so my doctoral dissertation, focused on the prevalence of political gender stereotypes among Flemish voters, and how this kind of gendered bias influences voters' perceptions and evaluation of women in politics. So when I was invited to participate in this panel, I did not hesitate for a second, because I think that there's a direct link with my research focus and my expertise. I think that gender bias can be considered as a general social phenomenon that manifests itself in different domains across our society, in the labor market, in the political sphere, but also within academia and science in general. So I think that there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between my expertise and the main focus of this panel, which will hopefully be discussed later on. So that's it, I think, for the introduction about myself and my research. Then regarding the question about what role does gender bias play in the gender distributions that we see in academia, I think that it's also relating to my field of work and my field of expertise. I think there's a very famous quote by Hillary Clinton, who said that the idea that women have to fit certain stereotypes is a weight around the ankle of every ambitious woman. And the fact that this idea exists, yeah, it should be called out for what it is. It's a way of, it's a kind of a cultural, a political, even an economic game that is being played to keep women in their place. And so this comes, yeah, this plays around in different fields of our society, in the labor market, in the political sphere, but also in academia. And I think that a lot of the unequal position of women and men in academia is actually based on this kind of gender bias and this kind of descriptive gender stereotyping that exists. So this refers to the idea that we all have an idea about who women and men presumably are and what they are supposed to do. And there's a whole lot of research that has focused on the fact that we have the idea that there are considerable gender differences in, for example, intelligence, ambition, but also assertiveness, which prevent women from being viewed as suitable leaders in, for example, politics, which is my field of research. But I think that this discrimination or bias against women for high status jobs in, for example, academia also holds. So it's also based on the same kind of descriptive gender stereotypes that characterize women mainly as lacking the necessary personality traits that are that one needs to fulfill these jobs and to get these leadership tasks. So I think this is strongly related to some kind of role congruity theory and ideas, which refers to the idea that we all have a baseline or a basic idea about what kind of roles should be taken on or up by women and men. And this, this is based on the observations that we have from people in their daily lives. So in this logic, we think that women are mainly occupied within the private sphere with care responsibilities, with raising children, with doing the household. And therefore, we also think that they have the capacities and the competences that are useful in this kind of context. And for men, we hold other ideas. We think that they're most likely to hold high status and public roles in the public sphere, and they also have characteristics that are useful to fulfill these roles. And so taken together, I think there's a whole lot of bias that comes from these gender roles that we ascribe to women and men, and these come into play in different contexts and different spheres, leading to the underrepresentation or the unequal position of women and men in these high status roles, such as in science and in academia. And I think that if women want to reach for these higher positions, then there's a whole lot of bias and hurdles that they have to face that men do not.
Thanks a lot. This is a strong start. Maybe Jenny, I think you've also have some specific views on this, so you can just go ahead with the next contribution.
Yes, thank you, Tanya. Yeah, so my name is Jenny Feldman. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology at the University of Leuven. I'm a social psychologist. I'm actually currently finishing up my dissertation. I'm going to submit it in 2 weeks. So if I look very exhausted, that is the reason. So in my research, I look at how the social groups to which we belong, such as based on gender, socioeconomic status, and the stereotypes attached to them, how that influences us. So in most of my work, I look at understanding our representation of certain social groups in work and education fields, such as women in STEM or low SAS students at university. And also looking at how people are not just passively experiencing those stereotypes, but also how people actively try to cope with it and try to achieve their goals. For example, trying to obtain a sense of belonging, a sense of that, you fit in and you belong in the organizational setting that you're in. And I think what is also in addition, because Robin already covered a lot, but in addition to that, maybe one thing I could add is that I think in discussions on these topics, it's often about either discrimination, hindering, for example, women in academia, or different choices that women make. But I think, and also in our research, we see that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's actually a pretty complex interaction between those two. So women definitely face barriers and bias, and they are often relatively subtle and not, the very overt bias, saying like, academia is not for women is not as acceptable in society anymore, fortunately. And I think it's often about like subtle experiences that you might have that give you a feeling that I'm not sure that this domain or that this field is for me. And I think in what is relevant in academia or in STEM, maybe more specifically, where I've done my research, or in that domain of my research more, there's a strong emphasis on characteristics in line also basically what Robin said, with characteristics that we typically associate more with men. And these stereotypes, they change very, very slowly. So changes in society are not reflected in stereotypes very quickly. And for example, if we look at academia, there is this association with that we associate science more with like competition, with working independently, being like an excellent scholar, or being brilliant, or being a genius. And those are also characteristics we associate more with men. So, and this influences it influences how we interpret behavior of other people, how suitable we think other people are. And oftentimes it's not really these explicit forms of bias, but basically kind of like the masculine defaults that there are in this domain or within academia. And these relatively subtle cues can also lead women to doubt whether they have a place in this domain. I feel like, is this really for me? And they might try to adjust and be just as competitive as anybody else, or conform kind of like to the norms that are there. But I think also, in a way, like you also always lose that. So if people in a domain sort of try to assimilate basically to the norms that are there, you also lose a lot of diversity that those people do bring. And it also, they are also often perceived more negatively for example, showing, or women are perceived more negatively for showing competitive behavior, for example. So I think we also really have to look at or reconsider the structures that are there, the processes, the procedures in academia. Like, what do we reward? What is valued? Teaching versus research, for example, team research versus being like this genius individual that does all this research on his own. If we really want to create more diversity and be more inclusive for people with more diverse backgrounds. So yeah, I think that is my 2 cents on this topic for now.
Thanks a lot. I see a lot of agreement in the panel members, but I'm sure, Josephine, for example, I think you've worked on this topic for a long time also in your research. So maybe you can add something to what has been said so far.
Yes, I'm happy to add to Jenny and Robin, who indeed already covered a lot. So I'm Josephine de Leersnijder. I'm a professor at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology at the University of Leuven. And although my main line of research is on sociocultural diversity, in the past few years I have read a lot about gender diversity as well in my role as a member of the Young Academy of Belgium, because 2 years ago on the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, our Young Academy launched a campaign to promote more gender equality in our Flemish universities. And yeah, so this was a campaign that wanted to raise awareness on the topic of implicit bias. People who are interested can still read a lot on all the information we gathered back then on the website. Wetenschap is MVX. So we really wanted to highlight that science is something for males, females, and people who don't identify with any of these 2 gender categories. So, and what we really wanted to highlight is how people who don't fit to this stereotype of this male professor, the images that Jenny and Robin already sketched, I mean, how they might be faced with very subtle forms of bias throughout the whole academic system. So, and what we then did with the Young Academy was also, we listed best practices, and I'm happy to talk about some of them that are empirically supported by research on how we might try to overcome some of these barriers that people face who don't fit this stereotypical male professor idea. So, and this resulted in June 2019 in a new charter on gender equality that was signed by all rectors of the Flemish universities. So, and that's also encouraging them to take the next steps, and importantly also to monitor the figures, because I think it starts there if we really want to tackle a certain problem, such as the underrepresentation of women and girls in our science and in our Flemish institutions. Then it starts with having the data on how much women there actually are at each step of the scientific ladder. So to really be aware where the pipeline is leaking and to think about what can we do about this. And I saw in the chat that people were asking Jenny for giving some concrete examples of how this gender bias might manifest itself and how we can overcome it. So I'm happy to share already some insights, if I may, and then perhaps Jenny can take back over. But for instance, if we think about this idea that Jenny and Robin already highlighted, that we associate men and scientists more with these traits of being agentic and being a leader and being brilliant and being a genius. Well, this also reflects in very practical things that make up our academic structure, such as, for instance, job advertisements. So how jobs are advertised in academia, it's often very much imbued with a language that call people, you should be a genius, you should be a leader, you should be innovative, all these traits that we typically associate with men. So this is in a very subtle way creating a lot of barriers for people who don't have the feeling that they fit that stereotype. So we know that females are then less likely to recognize themselves in the profiles that are described there, and that they are less likely to apply. Some people even say that females in academia, that they should have the feeling that they fit the profile for 100% of even more before they consider applying to a position, while this threshold is about 60% for males. If they meet these criteria just a little bit, then they will already apply. And the same thing then also if these committees are looking at CVs of males and females, then they might think explicitly or implicitly that the females just have a better fit with the job descriptions, but then the job descriptions in themselves are already a bit biased. So, and the same thing also with letters of recommendation, for instance, we know that the words that people use to describe the talents of males and females, that they also differ according to these gender stereotypes that we have. And then again, females are more described as being good team players and hardworking, while males tend to be described as being this genius or this innovative leader in his or her field. So again, these subtle biases in the letters of recommendation, in people's CVs, in people's, also in how they present themselves, these might also then feed back to the selection committees, making it very much harder for females to be hired in a position as a professor at our universities. So this is just like one way in which this gender biases that we all have, males and females, we all have them, how they manifest themselves in the academic reality of today. So, and one way to overcome this, of course, is to screen our job advertisements and the letters of recommendations for gendered word use, and also to have people within our selection committees who have the mandate to watch out for gender bias if it is creeping into the discussions that we have about candidates, for instance.
I'll be happy to go on and to continue. And I think we'll come back to the questions as also that were being put to Jenny, but we'll keep that for the end of the session. Thanks a lot. I would like to give the floor to everybody, so to have a full overview. And we've already touched a little bit upon the fact that diversity is more than just gender. And I think it's really important. Of course, today is really about gender because this is the topic. But still, I would like to ask a question to Dunya, because when it's also digging a little bit further into diversity, do you think that it is different for women of other represented groups? That when we're talking about gender unbalance and about the gender bias, and when we're talking about underrepresented group, it can be, of course, non-white academics, but it can be also people with a handicap or people from the LGBTQI plus community, or anyone who's associated with an underrepresented group. Dunya, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Tanya. Maybe first of all, to introduce myself, my name is Dunya Boraben. I'm a PhD researcher at the Sociology Department of the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. And I'm also an editorial member of the Tijdschrift voor Genderstudies and a member of the Evaluation Commission on the Federal Anti-Discrimination Law. So my time and work revolves around investigating and studying mainly everyday forms of inequality, and mostly in terms of sexism and gendered racism. In particular, I have been studying the experiences of female early career researchers with everyday sexism in academia. And I have also flipped the lens as I am also looking into the perceptions, attitudes, and ideas of campus leaders. So mostly department heads about diversity, equality, and especially the related policies that have become quite popular in higher education. And I'm very happy to be part of this event today, as it's always nice to share the work I have been doing on inequality in the academic institution and to raise awareness, but mostly to also hear from others within this field how they try to tackle bias and inequality in academia. And I think this question is very important because when we talk about gender, we often forget how it unavoidably intersects with other identity characteristics, such as ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. So based on my research, I would like to offer maybe two practical examples of how ethnicity triggers different dynamics and therefore different experiences for women with a migration background compared to women without a migration background. And so to give a bit of context, I conducted research in all Flemish universities with women at the doctoral and the postdoctoral level. And I've conducted in-depth interviews to discuss their experiences with the work environment, the work climate, how they have experienced certain microaggressions, harassment, and so on. And based on these in-depth interviews, I could actually identify 4 general forms of everyday sexism and gendered racism. And one particular form that was exclusively discussed by women with an ethnic minority background was one of patronization. And to give an example of what patronization exactly entails and what it means, women with a migration background mentioned that they experienced a paradox in which, on the one hand, their objectivity is being questioned because they do not seem to be fitting this ideal academic, as has already been mentioned before. But on the other hand, they are also considered to be those that are the most fit, or rather only fit, to conduct research that is related to their identity. And this was mainly in the humanities and the social sciences, where women discussed how they were considered to be those who were the most suitable for research projects around ethnic relations, migration, inequality, and so on. And so their ethnic background becomes a kind of proxy for subjectivity, as if they are not equally able to be objective like other academics, and which of course is one of the most important elements we as academics need to uphold when conducting research. But another example of bias that was experienced by women with a migration background across all disciplines was a bias of their perceived language deficiency. So they feel that they are continuously monitored on their language, which is also very specific to our Flemish context. And although these women are born and raised in Belgium, they have a degree and are pursuing a PhD degree, or they already obtained a PhD degree at a Flemish-speaking university, their ability to speak proper Dutch is often questioned. And this great emphasis on language, of course, goes back to our integration policies that considered language proficiency to be the key to integration. But that's why it's also absolutely necessary that when we talk about gender, that we do not start from this normative framework that it considers only women without a migration background, but also heterosexual women and so on. But that being underprivileged on different axes of one's identity creates unique barriers and can create additional barriers that should be considered also equally relevant when we talk about gender issues and when we are creating, for example, these gender policies that we have at our universities currently. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. We're continuing the spectrum to go around the spectrum of diversity. And today we have a few male panelists also, and we're very happy because that's also part of the diversity. Walter, I think we can go on to your intervention. You are working in a very gender unbalanced environment. If we're looking at the famous leaky pipeline, what do you think are the factors that contribute to this situation? You have the floor, Walter.
Okay, thanks. To start to introduce myself, I'm not a researcher in gender studies. So what I know about gender effects is from my own experience and to a large extent anecdotal. And I've been working since, since my graduation. First, I had a career in industry and then in academia. And I've been working in an industry that is largely male in the sense that I'm an engineer. And the amount of women in engineering is limited to, in most countries, below 10%. And that means that if we assume that women are as capable as men in doing engineering, we're missing 1 out of 9 of the high quality profiles that we could use in the industry and we could use in academia. And that's a pity, because, well, it has been touched before, and it has been said before, that there is no significant difference in the ability of women to do science or engineering, but still they have different traits, they have different capabilities. And we are missing those capabilities in engineering. Maybe to mention a few to make it a little bit less abstract, what I see in the few female students that I have had so far, and those are limited to 6, and I've been teaching and working in academia since 2006, and I have been teaching 6 women in total. And what they all have in common is a great perseverance. They don't give up, they go on. And that's a trait that I don't very often see in male students. Of course, also the male students have some characteristics that the females don't have. For example, male students are I think, better in coping with failure, or at least they cope in a different way with failure, in the sense that they soon go to an attitude of don't care. I failed, but I don't care. While a lot of the females, well, they really struggle with the fact that they failed. I don't want to go in further detail on those traits, but it shows that, well, different traits have different benefits for science and for engineering. And the fact that, because the question was, where is the pipeline leaking? One of the major problems is that, yeah, it's certainly in academia, it's largely to a large extent a matter of the old boys club trying to protect their own club. And that might not be even from a how would I call it, a vicious or an intentionally crude way to do it. That might be, but even then, it might just be because of the fact that they don't use the traits and they don't use the perspective of women, people who are more like, which is, I think, a human thing. That's the bias that we have each within us, is to like people that are a lot like ourselves and are not a lot different. But we need that diversity, yeah, to get a good society, I guess. So, well, I've been trying since 2006 to get more women in engineering, but that has been a very frustrating endeavor with very little success. If you take a look in the engineering disciplines, we're not doing so bad in chemistry and biochemistry, in the sense that I think about 30 to 40% of the students are female, which is still an underrepresentation, but yeah, it's at least better than in the other departments. If you take a look in our teaching staff, in our research staff, then also in chemistry and biochemistry, we're not doing so bad, in the sense that I think also 40 to 50% are female. Still, what I have been seeing the latest years is that in the new hirings, we don't manage to hire female engineers anymore. So that number is declining, and that's worrying me. Now, to come back to the pipeline, and maybe then I'll give the floor to the rest of the discussion. Concerning the pipeline, I think the pipeline is, at least from my perspective, already leaking a lot sooner than only in academia, but it's leaking in secondary education and in primary education. And so what we have decided, I think, as a faculty, is that we will keep on trying to do good things for girls that come and study with us. And we do a lot of things. We put them in separate lab groups such that they can make a network and can really have a network of peers and they don't feel so alone. In our communication, we overuse our female students. I just told that I've taught 6 female students since 2006, but on every marketing event, and I refer to the sit-ins, which are used in Belgium to recruit students, there was always a girl student next to me giving information and trying to convince also the girls who were coming to get information. So yeah, we have been doing numerous things and we will keep on doing them, but I'm convinced that they won't make the difference. But just because of the fact that it's necessary, we'll keep on doing them. But since I think about 2 years, we're trying to get into the world of secondary education to make sure that we address the problem there, because, well, research has been done and has shown that in the beginning, early in life, girls and men are equal in their passion and in their enthusiasm about science. And all of a sudden it drops, and I refer to research that has been done in higher education, which shows that in the first year of their study, the most important thing or aspect in well-being is their passion about science. While if you go to the second and the third year of education, it turns to the feedback they get and the respect they get from their professors. And so in that sense, the passion is no longer the most important aspect, but it's, yeah, the feedback and the reception they get on who they are and what they do. And in the later years, it is, will I be feeling well in industry, for example, in our case. And I also think that same process of shifting from passion to respect and feedback and well-being and questions about the future takes place in primary education, also in secondary education. So it's a matter of stopping the leak in the pipeline there and making sure that at that moment, the women can keep on focus to passion, and that getting the respect and getting the feedback about, oh, you're doing well, or you have a difficulty with failure, for example. Let's work on that. It's not a problem. So, yeah, the way we can avoid the gender stereotypes, tackling that in primary and secondary education is very important, I think. Maybe a final comment on the job openings that were mentioned earlier. Well, in the university, we have been making job opening texts in a collaboration with the personnel department, in that sense that all the non-technical traits are being described by the personnel organization and probably are very gender neutral, or even more female oriented, because, well, the personnel department is to a great extent manned by females. But if you go to the text that specifies the requirements, that's still written by, yeah, the academic people, so by men. And indeed, maybe we should try to do that more in collaboration with a number of women, to make sure that even the tone and the words that are used there are more neutral, or more female oriented. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
To leave it to this.
Yes, and thanks a lot to you, Walter, but to all the panelists. Actually, it feels like we're just kicking off, but unfortunately, we have a tight schedule. So I think it would be best now maybe to let room for the question and answer and the comments, because I'm sure it will be filled in very easily also. And there are a lot of questions from the very beginning of all your interventions. So Liv, you have the floor to review some of the comments and the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you all participants and panelists for all the input we gathered in this first panel discussion. So this is an invite for all the participants sitting in front of their screens. Please share your questions in the chat as well, so I can take them into account, mentioning please the name of the speaker that you would like to address the question to. And I'm starting with a question a little bit back in the chat that was already partially answered by Josephine as well, but it was originally addressed also to Jenny. And it's about if you could give some examples how to overcome these subtle obstacles that you were mentioning. And Josefina, who posted the question, also mentions that she thinks that working with women in science can be already a good start in that regard. So Jenny, the floor is yours to answer this question.
Sorry, I started talking while being muted. So hopefully this is in line with where the question comes from. I think what is really important is to realize that how should I answer this? So I think often when we talk often about bias and things like that, it's often also about like, okay, we just need, women who don't have these biases, for example, as Josephine also said, everybody has these biases, doesn't really matter who you are. I mean, of course, there are differences in that. And I think oftentimes the question is, or the answer that is proposed is also like, we need implicit bias training. People need to know that this occurs, but that's not really a solution, I think. Or I know, we know that from research. So often it's really about like, how do the structures of our organizations, such as our university, how does that allow subtle bias, for example, hiring committees, what Josephine also alluded to earlier, to sneak in? And in what way can we make those procedures more objective and more structured, so that doesn't happen as much anymore? So for example, if you think about hiring or promotion, it's really important, for example, to have really clear, objective ideas of, okay, these are the criteria that we look at, and also really strictly adhere to that. So not think like, yeah, but I do see potential in that person. So if you ever hear somebody saying that, ask like, okay, but what does that mean? Like, what is the hard evidence? And do you see that why do you see that more in this person compared to somebody else? So do you give the benefit of the doubt to everybody or not? And because if with those kind of things, these kind of subtle biases start to sneak in. So yeah, I think that was my first thought in response to that.
Thank you very much.
I think Josephine also had some good thoughts about that, I think.
Yeah, and with that,
I was thinking, if I may add, one other example, I think also to let gender bias play a less big role in academia, is to reconsider how we evaluate researchers in general, because we know that these quantitative metrics that are now very central to the evaluation of good research, like citation scores, for instance, that they are highly susceptible to gender bias. So for instance, men cite themselves up to 56% more than women do. Men also cite other men much more. So this is artificially inflating the citation indices of men in comparison to women. Same thing we know from research, that the same article is more likely to get published when the first author is male than female, and that grants are more awarded to males than to females, even if the project is scored objectively as at the same quality level, just because people in the committee might think that males have more potentials. We also know that males are twice as likely to get invited for keynotes or contributions to special issues, rendering them more visible and thus more citable in their fields. So I think that one of the ways to let this gender bias that is so much shaping these quantitative metrics, to stop it from also shaping how we perceive women as successful in academia, is to also try to reconsider how we evaluate academics in general, and to take a much more holistic approach to the issue, and to look at it in more qualitative ways instead of only focusing on the quantitative ways of indexing research assessments. And maybe a last thing is internationalization, for instance, and then we get to all the practicalities, and I could talk more about it if people are interested, but that's also a requirement nowadays for academics to be considered successful, that you have spent so much time abroad. But if we think about the phases in our careers as females that we would have to go abroad. This often coincides with establishing a family life, and it makes it very hard, especially if our partners also have high-level jobs and are a bit older, and thus have more difficulties of traveling with us than vice versa would be the case. So that's another thing. If we could reconsider how important how important, for instance, internationalization is in the strict sense of having to spend so many months abroad, that's also one way of fighting the implicit gender bias. And by the way, I see in the chat people are asking for references. Please see the Wetenschap is MVX website for a lot of the studies that I'm citing here already.
Thank you very much, Josephine, and also Jenny. And I would like to take this point a little further, because Dunya was researching on campus leaders and their policies and their perception of diversity. And I would like to ask you with that, have you encountered some policies that are tackling this sense of what makes a person successful? Other matrices that were used by campus leaders?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And maybe I want to tie that together to something that Jenny also mentioned previously with regards to these bias trainings and how they are not working, and research has shown that. I think that indeed they are not as effective as we thought they are, but I think that doesn't mean that we have to completely erase them. And that's also based on the research that I've done with heads of departments, and this research was also across Europe. And one of the countries was Finland. And in Finland, for example, heads of departments talked about how they had, for example, a department day where they came together with colleagues to talk about these topics in a very open way, and really to try and work on providing a more safe and inclusive environment. And it was also in these universities that they were obliged, as soon as they started working there, to follow a certain kind of training to become more aware of their biases, but also on how they need to assess a person. And they indicated themselves that it is quite difficult because you are still trying to focus on these ideal characteristics of an academic when you're reading recommendation letters and so on. But because they try and talk about this, because they have these department days within their own department and among colleagues, I definitely think that this can still be something effective. So that would be one of the more practical things I think are important, and I think also helps in introducing them in these very decisive moments of an academic's career. So for example, in hiring and in recruitment procedures. So yeah, that's what I would like to add on that.
Thank you very much, Dunya, for this view into the future that you just gave. With that, we are running out of time for this last question round of this panel. So I would like to thank you again for all your contributions and also answering the questions from the chat. Tanya, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a little bit frustrating, and especially because we're not on a real live session, we can't grab a coffee and ask such and such speaker to elaborate a little bit more. But I think this is the first edition. You all have the names and the reference of everybody, so you feel free to contact them after that. And I would like to thank again everybody from the panel. We have now a 5-minute break before we come to the next panel. So please grasp a coffee or another drink, as we've seen in the Mentimeter, stretch your leg, and we'll see you at 1 at 1:05 sharp. Thank you.